request to show how to train reading the definition of the situation in chess. So I'm just going to demonstrate myself doing it, and I can't promise that I'm the best at this. I'm just, yeah, but I'll put it in practice. Okay, so anyways, and just to remind you guys, it's basically just identifying the motifs, especially after the puzzle, to pin down why the puzzle worked. Okay, like why the answer worked, why the tactic worked, and that trains you to identify kind of the precursors of the tactics while you're playing, and it'll make you so tactically sharp. You'll recognize the preconditions for the tactics. So let's get on with this puzzle here. It is white to play. First thing I like to do is just to know the material count, so that I know whether I'm looking for a draw or a win. So I'm down a knight, so I can take it back here with the pawn. I can also take the rook, but then he has a knight fork here. I run with the king, he takes the rook, and he's still up a piece. So taking the rook is probably isn't it. Taking the knight leaves us kind of equal. Okay, but now I solved it, because if I want to take the rook and he's going to go here, forking the king and the rook, then I can just take away something so that his fork doesn't work. So I check first with the rook, okay, and then I take the rook, and there's no more fork, okay. But now this is the key thing, like identifying why this tactic worked. Here I kind of have to be creative about this, why it worked. So first of all, we know there's a forking square here, so that's one of the motifs that underpins this tactic. Okay, so I had to recognize that. And this is an in-between move. So if I know that his response relies on a sequence like this, then I can take something out. And that's actually one of the keys to defending, I found, is if you know exactly what conditions an attack requires, then all you need to do is pick out one of those things so that those conditions are no longer, then the attack will fail. So this is actually a really cool tip there. Yeah, if when you're trying to become a better defender, but I won't unpack it too much right now. But yeah, so like when your opponent's attack, it relies on kind of a sequence and also relies on certain things being in place. Then if you want to defend, you just have to take away one thing with it. So I just took it away with an in-between move. Now his fork doesn't work. Okay, let's keep going here. And also, of course, there's hanging pieces, right? This is the motif here would be a hanging piece on pre. When you have like so I guess black kind of needs tempos to save both pieces. So already that's one of the motifs there. Anyways, let's keep going here. Okay, what's going on? So I like to do the material count very quickly here. So let's look at two minor pieces, two rooks, queen, queen, pawns, equal pawns, everything's safe. But now motifs, there's an open king here. So obviously that's going to factor in. There is a knight fork in the air. My rook's protecting that, but then this would also be, my queen would be hit by the rook. So I'm recognizing these little motifs here. So I know black, whatever black has to do, has to probably be fast, or he has to move the queen away. So that this thing is not there, right? This is, what is that, an X-ray? Or laser attack, X-ray, something like that. Discovered attack waiting to happen. But anyway, so I start looking at checks and captures first. When you're solving puzzles, even during a game actually, it pays off to look at checks and captures first, because even if they don't work, they tell you about how the position is held together. So let's examine this very obvious check here. Rook check. White's king will run. He won't block with the queen. Or actually bishop can block. Okay, there's also knight I can take here. So why can't I just take the knight? Okay, now other things, I did not notice this. So this shows me some tact. I haven't solved puzzles in a while, so I'm kind of tactically blind at times. So the rook is hitting the queen. Queen is also hitting the rook, so that's an added factor there. Okay. So if I take the knight, he would take my rook. See, that was important for me to identify. So then if I took the queen, then he would check. Rook takes, and he takes my queen, and then I block with something, and I'm a piece up. So taking the queen would be winning a piece. But I'm also looking at, just like the last tactic, can I throw like a monkey wrench in there? That's another cool term, monkey wrench. Sometimes you can really screw up your opponent's plans. Just throw a monkey wrench in there. So if I know that, yeah. So can I mess this up somehow? So check. No, nothing. Not really anything. So I think it's straightforward. Take the queen, take the knight, and then block with something. Right, tapped over. So why did this tactic work? Well, I mean, there's an unprotected queen there, and he was relying on this to win the queen back. But I just take that. So I mean, there's not much to cover here, honestly. We'll skip it. Not many motifs to identify. Here, actually, just by looking at it, I already saw that this is a kind of a weak back rank because only the rook guards the back rank. So that motif just popped out at me. There's also an unprotected knight sitting there. That's a motif that popped out at me. Actually, the rook can access the back rank. So if we can move the rook, that's got to be something. So already that tells me that queen e2 is likely the answer. So actually, this time I just automatically identified the motifs before even solving the puzzle. And actually, this was not on purpose. So that kind of tells you the power of this strategy. I hadn't solved tactics in a long time, so when I came into the puzzles, it was not habitual. But now, by solving the last 2 or 3 puzzles, I've made identifying the motifs habitual. And so when I came into this puzzle, already I just I didn't even try to. I just even before I did the material count, I found myself just automatically like, hey, there's a motif here, there's a motif here, there's a motif. Queen e2 is probably the right answer, and I haven't even started my deliberate thought process yet. But let's do it deliberately here. Material count is equal. Okay, now yes, there's an unprotected knight, weak back rank. So queen e2, what does this do? It attacks this unprotected piece and that rook, a double attack. He cannot defend both. Takes my queen, I have back rank, checkmate. I think that's the answer. Yes. So you see how it was so automatic identifying the motifs, and it made solving the tactics super simple. And you'll find this like in a real game. If you've been doing this strategy for a while, the definition of the situation, when you play a game, tactics will be popping out at you. Even the preconditions for the tactics will be popping out at you. Okay, at least that's what happened to me in my last tournament. I was sharp as hell. Won 4 out of 4 in the first 4 rounds. Anyways, let's keep going here. So already before even doing the material check, things are just popping out at me. So honestly, there's a check there. The king is cut on the back rank there, so if I can get a rook on the back, that would be something. I can also see that if the king was here, if I can drive, like this check popped up at me. If I can check here, the king went back there, then that would be a checkmate. So the weak back rank, of course the bishop is protecting that square, otherwise that check would be nice. Even if I take the bishop there, that's not really helping me. Okay, something just popped out at me. I was supposed to do the material check first, but my mind's kind of racing ahead, which is awesome because now it's all becoming habitual. So I started looking at this check because remember, checks and captures you want to look at first. So I just started like, my mind just went ahead like there, check, king here, and then boom, I take the bishop because that will be a pin. Okay, so when you solve puzzles like this deliberately at first, then it becomes really automatic. Boom. Now I should have done a blunder check, but I got too carried away. But let's see what motifs are making this work. So first of all, king safety. The king only had 1 square, so already his options are really limited, and that lets me kind of play my opponent like a fiddle. There's a weak back rank going on, and check here. That is a pin. If that's a pin, then this pawn is not really defending the bishop. Then I can take it. So those are kind of the motifs there. And this pawn, that pawn is crucial to this tactic. It's really just trapping the king on that back rank. So like weak king combined with this, yeah, whatever. Let's keep going here. All right, here. Okay, so this check is popping up at me, but before we look at that, let's do this material because it's a messy position. So we got 3 minor pieces each, rook, pawn, so I'm up a pawn, okay? And that's a strong pass pawn in the endgame, but it won't factor into the tactic. Okay, now we start looking at forcing moves, I guess. Although, honestly, identifying some motifs would be better. Let's do that first. So that's an unprotected bishop. That's an unprotected bishop. Unprotected rook. So you know there's got to be some shit in the air. That's a passed pawn, so there could be a pawn promotion kind of tactic. And we got two bishops that are useless for now. That knight is not doing much. Inactive knight, passive on the rim. But I think these three minor pieces being undefended like this, and the king being yeah, in the scope of a check, these things are going to factor into the tactic. So let's start being concrete about this. So look, checks and captures first. Knight check. Let's say he goes in the corner. Then I've already got a fork on c3, hitting the bishop and rook. In which case, yeah, I mean, he would have to go bishop f3, then I win an exchange, and then probably win the bishop 2 on the back. So knight e2, where else can he go? He can go king f1, but then same thing, I think, just knight c3, and not seeing... Okay, wait, but there is rook takes d3. So let's say check, king f1, knight c3, he has rook takes d3. But there I have a check. And then the king cannot go there because of the knight. He has to run away, and then I still take the bishop. So this kind of motif is similar to the first puzzle we did, where if his counterattack or defense kind of has a linchpin, kind of requires a long sequence like that, or many things, many components, we can take away one of those components. So I showed you guys after check, knight c3, rook takes d3, and his idea is if I take the bishop, he takes my rook. So what does that require? That requires that my rook be here so that he has this pin on my knight. So if I know that, then I just take that away. I checked first, got that rook out of there with an in-between move, then I'll take the bishop. Okay? Yeah, see? Now actually I messed this up. I did not calculate this line. That was a blind spot. Okay, so that tells me I need to improve this. That was stupid. I thought I could check with the rook and then take the bishop. However, here, fortunately for me, it still works out. So for example, taking the bishop, he takes the rook, and I take this bishop, I'm actually winning in material. That's probably the answer. Let me just do a quick check here that I can't just move the rook away somehow. No, I can't. Alright, what tech is this? Okay, so why did that tactic work? First of all, again, I'm not going to repeat this thing. I already identified these things, that it's got 3 undefended pieces. So yeah, it was just a lot. Okay, keep going here. Alright, so already before I even do anything, my mind raced ahead and saw that this is a power balance square where equal attackers and equal defenders. That is a hot zone for tactics because if you add an attacker, you win the square, or if you take away a defender, like remove the king from here, then I win the rook. So that's most likely going to be part of the answer. And in fact, I've found that most times when I lose a game, it's because a power balance, like I have 2 power balance squares and my opponent manages to attack both, and I drop one. Like that's a very, very common way to lose a game. Anyway, so that's kind of the theme the motif that's gonna factor into the tactic. Now I've also got an advanced pass pawn. That's also a motif. So then I start thinking, okay, let me just run with the pawn, and he's gonna be really strapped to this rook. Okay, and the rook cannot come to the back to guard that pawn. He has to use the king. I'm not seeing another way. How does he stop the pawn? He does have a check, although that's not really helping. I move the king, and he takes the rook. I can even promote there. So that's not really helping him. Push the pawn, king has to go there. Then I can even promote and take the rook. So honestly, I think it's an easy kind of tactic. So let me just double check here. I thought here. Now why can't I go there? Because he goes there. Okay, so this is good. Let me promote. So I won't go further into that. I already identified the motifs. The motif was this power balance square here. And yeah. So we remove the defender so that we win that power balance square. And here already it jumps out at me that I've got a focal point. We call that a focal point for the checkmate on g2. And this is a pin. So you guys notice how my usual thought process is to look at the material to see who's up in material, so I know if I'm playing for a draw or a win. But my mind is racing ahead and identifying the motifs so that I'm kind of automatically solving these tactics without even being deliberate about it. That is what you want. Okay, so identifying the motifs deliberately makes it automatic so that the preconditions for the tactics pop out at you. Okay, so like already without even being deliberate about anything, I noticed, hey, focal point for a tactic, for a checkmate. Hey, what's stopping it? There's a pin here. And rook takes knight is a kind of a forcing capture that could factor into this, whatever. Okay, and c4 just jumped out at me because I'm thinking, if I have a checkmate here, he's defending with the pin, let's remove a component of this defense. c4, that's a monkey wrench. Okay, so, and like I said, this is a very important lesson. When you're attacking or defending, if you can see how your opponent's sequence is held together with various components, then you take away one component. Like, I haven't heard this being mentioned, but I think I'll actually make a future video on this. This is so key. Such an important insight I had when you realize every attack and defense is held together by components. You can remove a component, your opponent's whole idea falls apart. So here c4 is a monkey wrench, where now if knight takes, let's say, then the pin is no longer there and I have a checkmate. My checkmate works. If queen takes, then I think then okay, now we have a different precondition, different motifs in the air. I already just spotted it. It's rook takes knight, but let me tell you guys why it works. The queen is defended by the knight once it hops to c4. So if so that's power balance square. One attacker, one defender. So if we can add an attacker or remove a defender, we win the queen. So in this case, we remove a defender with the rook takes knight. And now the cool thing is, if he takes the queen, then the rook can take the queen and it's no longer being attacked by the pawn. Okay. So again, not much to cover there. I already identified all the motifs. Let's keep going here. Now here, again, it just popped out at me that this bishop is overloaded. It's guarding the knight and the queen. Although the rook is also guarding the queen. But it shows me like, hey, there's something in the air here. Something fishy going on. Because if I take the queen, let's say, and let's say the bishop took the queen back, then bishop would win that knight. Yeah. But of course, now it makes me think, if the rook is defending the queen, then the rook will have to move. Now I'm starting to think of the components, right? So, okay, that means the rook needs to be there. It also makes me think, hey, look, now the knight can jump in there and hit whatever's on f3 and the rook on d3. So, again, my mind's just racing ahead and identifying. I've kind of got the solution already. And now often, once you have the motifs working for you, you need to try out different permutations, different move orders to see which one clicks, which one works. So like when my knight goes to e5 to fork these two things, what piece do I want on f3? I don't want the knight there because the knight would take my knight on e5. I want the bishop to be sitting there. So that means I'll probably take on f3 first with the bishop. Bishop takes, I'll take the queen, rook will be here, then I play knight e5, and I win something. Okay, so you see how effortless the solution was for me when I've identified exactly how everything is held together, the motifs in the air, what components are required for my opponent's whole geometry to be, the physics to be working. Okay, so the first move is like queen takes, rook is forced to take, not bishop because then the knight hangs. Okay, so we know the rook will end up here on d3. Then next move will be to take the knight. Now if bishop takes, knight e5 wins. Now one more thing here, after this rook takes, if I take the knight, he can also take my knight, but then his bishop will be hanging on d2. So that's an unprotected piece, that's the motif there. Okay, let's play it. Boom. Okay. Now technically I should be identifying the motifs after solving the puzzle, but that'll come from more harder puzzles. Right now I've already solved the puzzle by identifying all the motifs in the beginning, so I don't need to be redundant about it. Okay, here we've got an unprotected rook, we've got a passed pawn, and the knight is controlling this square from where the rook could potentially stop the pawn. So you guys see how like automatically my mind is identifying these things, even though usually my deliberate thought process would have been to look at the material first. Okay, material is equal. Okay, and this bishop is also stopping the pawn. So these are kind of the components that are holding the position together, making everything work. Then my mind starts thinking, okay, how do I fuck with these components? How do I remove some things to make my own plan work, right? So that's also a kind of wide open king, so it leaves open a lot of checks like knight check, rook check, rook check. knight check here. Like for example, if I knight check here, bishop takes, then the bishop's not even eyeing that pawn on a2 or a7. So I mean, these are all things that can factor into the solution. Now let's be deliberate about it. Okay, so for example, if I push the pawn to a7, now, and I've also spotted that if the rook checks somewhere, then my king can always go to h3. It's safe there. Okay, so let's think about it. So a7. Now, whatever my opponent does, next move I'm threatening rook f8 check, king takes, and then pawn promotes. And the rook cannot even go here to stop that. So what can he possibly do? He's not going to take with the bishop and like, okay, so pawn a7, I'm threatening rook f8. So in that case, he probably has to go king g6 so that there's no check with my rook. And that's a tough one. Can I do something about that? Okay, check this out. If a7, king g6, now that unprotected, the rook being unprotected here factors into things. Then I go rook b8. Now bishop doesn't have time. So actually there's another, that thing I talked about before, identifying the components. I knew that when my pawn is on a7, I need to move the rook out, okay? And I need to preferably move the rook out with some sort of attack so that I have time to push the pawn without the bishop taking on a7, okay? So my attack was to attack the king, but the king ran away to g6 in my defense. So now we attack the rook instead. Okay, so don't even give him time to take with the bishop on a7. Now he's completely fucked. So I think that's the answer then, a7. And he played the defense. Okay, so some of you guys watching might be higher level than me, and you'd be like, okay, this is Patzerish talk. I don't need to hear about this. But others of you who are kind of lower rated, anticipating your opponent's defenses is key. That is what separates you from a weaker player. Okay, like that's the mark of maturity of a chess player is defense, honestly. And I've read this in a book too. I think it was in a nice book actually. I was just skimming it. Jan Marcos, a grandmaster, wrote a book with David Navarra, and I was skimming through that PDF and talked about this, how the mark of maturity for a grandmaster, what separates a grandmaster from an amateur, let's say, is defense. Or what separates a grandmaster from, let's say, a 2200 is they can play defense. They can salvage all sorts of positions. So you have to be able to anticipate defenses, not just your own attacks, okay? Like most 1600s out there will probably see this idea of, hey, like let me move the rook away and promote the pawn. But how many of them will spot black's defense as well? Okay, how we go here? What the heck is this? Let's keep going. I'll stop soon with this video. Let's keep going for a little bit longer here. So what the heck is going on here? There we got a knight under attack. We've got a bishop here, but it's kind of protected once, so that could drop. And if I take the bishop, knight takes, then he's safe. But then, okay, this bishop is also under attack. There's one defender, just the queen. So that's a power balance square. This bishop on d2. Okay, so I haven't seen the answer yet. So now we look at the material. Okay, so 3 minor pieces each, rooks. Everything's equal. Even the pawns are equal. Everything's equal, okay. And now we look for some forcing sequences to know how the position is held together. So I thought if I take the bishop and let's say king takes, then I can win the knight at least. But no, bishop takes, he's going to take back with the knight, and he's safe for now. So what if I take the knight first, and he takes the bishop? Now knight takes, then rook takes, and I'm always looking like, hey, is anything being unguarded, anything falling, anything being weak to hanging? No. So this is kind of a tougher puzzle. Okay. See, identifying the motifs is key. I did not do that. This motif I missed. The bishop is in the line of this rook. That could factor into this tactic. For example, let's say rook takes bishop, queen takes, and then I take this rook. He takes the bishop. The material is equal, but then at the end of it, I win the knight. Okay? Interesting. and then I just have to look for any intermezzos my opponent can play, because my sequence requires many components. See, that idea popped up again. So queen takes. First of all, he can't do any bullshit because the queen is hanging. So most likely he has to take the rook. Then I take the bishop, and luckily take the rook. Sorry, and luckily for me, there's no knight intermezzo here on f5 because the bishop is covering that square. So in that case, so he's gonna have to take back, and then I take the knight. And I just lastly I have to see if there's any attacking possibilities for him. Not that much. Maybe he'll take on b7, but I don't need to see that far ahead. Fuck that. Let's go for this. There we go. So what motifs held this thing together? And you see how the puzzle was solved once I recognized this last motif of the bishop being in the same line as the rook. Until I identified that motif, which took me a long time in this puzzle, until I recognized this, I was not able to solve the puzzle. So you see how key it is. So that's why, like when I was playing that tournament, the BC Open, when I won 4 out of 4 in the first 4 rounds, and I was so sharp, I realized during that game that it was more important for me to look at the definition of the situation than to look for tactics. Okay, because looking for tactics is fuck it. Anyways, looking for tactics will let you see some tactics. Okay, but looking at the definition of the situation will help you see all tactics, and even more than you would have if you had looked for tactics alone. Okay, so I don't know if that makes any sense. So I in that tournament, it was kind of the epiphany for me to look at the definition of the situation as opposed to tactics like I normally would. Okay, this was kind of a paradigm shift for me. It's powerful. So for example, if I looked at this puzzle with my old eyes, my old self, I would be looking for tactics. But tactics flow from the definition of the situation. So why not just look one step prior to the preconditions for the tactic? So once I identify this motif, then I don't even need to be deliberate about looking for the tactic. It pops up automatically. Okay? So be more deliberate about looking at the definition of the situation, these motifs, than about the tactic. The tactic will come once you recognize the motifs. Okay? And then it's just a matter of a little bit of concrete calculation to know the move order, to what move order to play it in, and then double check everything. Okay, so what motifs made this work? It was this bishop being in the same line as the rook. We had a power balance square here, one attacker and one defender, and we also had this knight being under attack. Okay. Anyway, let's keep going here. How long is this video already? Jeez, it must be so long. So I've already identified some power balance squares like this knight on d7, queen takes, king takes. That's a power balance square. This pawn on d6, also a power balance square. Two attackers, two defenders. The queen also kind of indirectly guards the knight, so that could potentially be a problem. There's a check in the air here. The king is kind of weak out there. And black's checks don't really do anything to me. Like even if queen a1, that rook just blocks. There's no other bullshit. So now this is the answer has not popped up at me. So now we start calculating a few sequences to make kind of the people call it geometry. I call it physics. How the physics of the position, how it's held together. Anyways. So which one do I want to look at first here? Let's say rook takes d6, okay? Then rook takes it's not giving me much. Bishop check is also actually a very natural one to look at first, although I was kind of putting it off because it's a messy, there are many defenses. Okay, so bishop g5, there's no f6 because I would take the rook. There's no rook takes because that would lose an exchange, so bishop g5, he has to go to the back rank. Let's say e8. Now this is interesting. Then I can play queen takes e5. Maybe? Because, or can I? No, I can't. Jesus. Oh, e8. What's going on here? So puzzles are getting harder as I'm solving them for sure. Because it's a free account. just leveling up the puzzles each time. So this is probably a very hard puzzle. One thing I'm looking at is after rook takes and rook takes, I can play bishop c5 with pinning the rook, adding an attacker. But these are all things that are kind of messy, so I'll look at them again later. Right now I'm kind of being lazy and looking for an easy solution if it exists, but it doesn't seem to. Like I'm looking at things like queen takes e5 because checks and captures I'm looking at first, but then knight takes. Here nothing. Bishop e5, king e8 doesn't seem like that much. So I might actually have to buckle down and actually look deeper into some of these messy lines. It's not an easy puzzle. Fuck. That sucks, eh? So okay, now let's start looking at messy things like bishop c5. What happens there? Then let's say knight takes, rook takes, rook takes. Like fuck, doesn't seem like anything there. I really like this idea. Bishop g5. Let's say king e8. He's not going to play king f8 because I would take the knight on d7. Okay, so king e8. And then I really want to play something like queen takes e5 because I see ideas of this motif like rook d8 on the back, supported by this bishop on g5 and supported by the rook on d2. So let's say queen takes e5, okay? The problem is that the knight can take. And then my idea is gone. Oh, shit, why is this puzzle so hard? Can I play bishop c5 right now? Oh. Maybe it is rook d6, rook d6, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes. Oh. b3? What am I doing here? If you guys can solve this puzzle before me, props to you. I don't know what the hell's going on here. What I'm really liking is bishop g5, king e8, and then rook d6, rook takes, and queen takes e5, but even that's not working. Let's go with another idea. After bishop g5, king e8, I can play rook takes f3, turning to f7. How does he deal with that? He would have to go like queen c4 or something. And then I would go, let's say rook. No, I can't. Yeah, this rook to d5 to block this protection. So that's an idea. And then let's say instead of queen c4, he tries rook g7. Then maybe even something like bishop h6. There's no rook h7, so he kind of drops f7 there. So I'm kind of going for that. Let's check it out. And I was thinking rook takes f3 here, and f7 cannot really be defended. Let's try it. And then here I was thinking I just block it with the rook. Amazing. That's a very hard puzzle to solve because it requires a quiet move. So yeah, like I said, this is a free account on Chess Tempo. It started off very easy, and they're leveling up the puzzles because I've been solving them consistently. So this is a very hard one. I don't want to fuck this up now. It's either queen takes rook or queen takes f7. Which one do I do? I say take the rook. Boom. I'll probably stop there. That was brutal. But I want to identify the motifs that made this work first. So first was we do have an open king, and our king is relatively safe. Not so I don't have to worry about this, which is actually gives us a clue. So even that motif that our king is kind of safe here, not many checks to get to it, means I can take the time to play a quiet move and build up my attack. Something as quiet as rook takes f3. So that's something to recognize there. Okay. Now bishop g5. What does that do? Okay, so I guess another motif. It's not just this. That's the power balance square. It's also this. That is. So now we're looking at focal points. Okay, so that's what actually made me take so long to solve this puzzle, is because I didn't have a full comprehension of the definition of the situation. I didn't even recognize this to be a motif that would factor into the solution at all. So you see how like how powerful this is. Like if I'm not able to solve a tactic, it's not able to recognize a tactic. It's not because I'm dumb. It's because I haven't seen the position for all it's worth. Okay, and this is actually an important lesson right here, because people look at what grandmasters are doing and then think I can never be a grandmaster, or I can never do this, right? And they don't realize grandmasters most of the time aren't calculating 20 moves deep. They're calculating many like 3 move deep lines, something which a lot of people can get to that level. What really distinguishes a grandmaster, of course they can go farther in their calculation, they're more disciplined, so on, but really it's the definition of the situation. And a stronger comprehension, like they've seen more grandmaster games, they've analyzed more grandmaster games, so they have a better idea of what's going on, and they have a better tactical vision. It's not necessarily the calculating prowess, although that is there, but it's being able to identify things like what's important in the position. Those things pop up. Those are things that are more salient to them. It's kind of like experiential blindness when you go to China or something, right? Like, um, if I went to China, I would be utterly overwhelmed. My brain wouldn't be able to process all the stimuli because it wouldn't have concepts to make sense of them and group them together. In the same way, you approach this puzzle, and let's say I don't know what your rating is. Maybe you're higher rated than me. But if let's say a 1300 goes into this puzzle, that 1300 will have no idea of what's relevant, what should be salient, what's important here. Whereas a grandmaster comes to this, they identify everything that's important in the position. Then it's a matter of calculating some lines and then making it stringing the moves together. So I came into this puzzle and I experienced some experiential blindness. I did not know that this was a focal point that would be so important in this puzzle. Okay, and we can actually get to it via this move order here. And then you realize, holy shit, black actually doesn't have ways to guard it. The only way is like rook there, and I can kick that out with the bishop. And the rook can't go there because the queen is covering that square. We look at that defense, and you noticed I was actually proud of myself because I spotted the defenses. I spotted this, and I knew that the rook could intercept, and this actually was the answer. So I'm actually kind of happy with myself coming back to solving puzzles after so long, and actually did a good job. So okay, thanks guys. Hopefully this helped. Till next time.